This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. However, sometimes I like to look at cards on the other end of the spectrum, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst cards from Alpha. A couple of weeks ago, I looked at the best cards in the set, and we certainly saw that the set is insanely strong. It was the most powerful MTG Top 10 I've ever done. However, while the set's highs are certainly impressive, it also has some really low lows. After all, it was the first set ever of the first trading card game ever, so they messed up on a few things. We saw that resulted in lots of overpowered mistakes in that other top 10, and in this one we'll see that there are lots of underpowered mistakes in the set too. Most of the cards on this list effectively don't do anything. While the cards that appear on this list and the order in which they appear is left up to my own opinion, there are some important things that have to be true about a card for it to show up on this list. First, it has to be bad in Magic's three main play modes, that is 40 card limited, 60 card constructed, and 99 card commander. Additionally, the card has to have always been bad. In other words, for a card to truly be considered one of the worst ever, it has to be bad everywhere and throughout all of Magic's history. Alright, here are my picks for the 10 worst cards from Alpha. At number 10, I've actually got 6 cards because they all have a similar problem. They're all auras that cost 1 white mana. Lance grants First Strike, and the Ward Cycle grants protection from a single color. One interesting pattern I noticed when I was making this video is that there are a lot of bad auras in Alpha. They had a very hard time designing auras that actually, do something meaningful enough to warrant existing, and these 6 auras definitely don't get there. So, what's the problem with these auras in particular? Well, none of them are worth the inherent risk that is associated with auras. You can easily get blown out when your opponent casts removal in response to one of these, and unless you've lined up a ward perfectly against opposing removal, you can also get 2 for 1 later in the game too. And none of these abilities are even good on a creature unless that creature is already good. That's a pretty big problem, as you want to play auras like this to make your creatures a lot better, but they don't really get close to achieving that on most creatures. At number 9, it is Cyclopean Tomb. As you can see on the original Alpha printing, this didn't have a mana cost. Unfortunately, this doesn't cost 0 mana. They just messed up when printing the card, something they remedied with the beta printing of the card, which shows you that it costs 4 generic mana. Then you can pay 2 mana and tap it to turn a non-swamp land into a swamp. You might be saying, but it doesn't say it taps, and you're right, but the mono artifact type the Tomb has does mean you can only use it once a turn, and the Oracle text today doesn't make use of this mono artifact type. Instead, the card just taps. Anyway, hosing mana can be pretty sweet, but this is really far from being Blood Moon. This is way too slow and expensive to ever really do a good job of hurting your opponent. Paying 6 total mana to turn an opposing land into a swamp just isn't going to have any real impact on most games, certainly not by the time you can finally do it, and you'd be a lot happier to just spend 6 mana by playing like a 6 mana 6/6. Furthermore, if your opponent ever destroys the Tomb, they ultimately get their lands back to normal. Of course, if your opponent wastes a card to destroy your Tomb, you might have a better chance of winning than you would otherwise. So this effectively does nothing in most cases, and spending a card and a bunch of mana on something that doesn't do anything is a good way to lose a game of Magic. At number 8, it is Creature Bond. For 1 generic in a blue, this aura can enchant a creature, and when that creature dies, the bond does damage equal to that creature's toughness to the creature's controller. So, you have to put this on an opposing creature, and then get rid of that creature for this to do anything, and it isn't remotely worth it. It's basically a really bad burn spell that requires you to fulfill 2 conditions. First, an opposing creature has to have enough toughness for this to ever be worth it, and second, you have to find a way to deal with that creature. That means you have to 2 for 1 yourself in a lot of situations, and that's not worth doing a few damage. If you can make an opposing creature die without using up a card, this isn't quite as bad, but the upside on the card is still incredibly minimal, even in the most ideal of situations, and in a lot of games, this just won't do anything. At number 7, it's Power Leak, another aura. This one can enchant enchantments. That already makes how useful this can be pretty low, as enchantments are the least prevalent non-planeswalker permanent type in the game. But then even when you do have an enchantment to put this on, it doesn't do a whole lot. At the beginning of the upkeep of Enchanted Enchantments controller, that player can pay any amount of mana, then Power Leak does 2 damage to that player, but X of that damage is prevented, where X is the amount of mana that player paid. So the idea here is that you put your opponent in a pick your poison scenario. Either they have to pay mana to keep their enchantment around, or they lose life. That sounds sort of good on paper, but giving an opponent a choice between those two things is awful. In a majority of board states, your opponent will be able to choose the one that doesn't really affect them. Either they have plenty of life or plenty of mana, and Power Leak ends up having zero impact on the game. At number 6, I've got 4 cards that do very similar things, and guess what? They're all auras. Wanderlust, Warp Artifact, Feedback, and Cursed Land can all enchant a permanent of a certain type and make that permanent's controller lose 1 life during their upkeep. In other words, they're a lot like Power Leak, except that they cost more mana, which I think makes them slightly worse than the Leak is. We're splitting hairs here though because they're all really bad. Spending a whole card just to make a permanent hurt your opponent a tiny bit just isn't worth doing. That would probably be true at virtually any mana cost, but it's even more true when you have to spend this much mana on it. Basically, these have no real impact on the board, and most of the time, slowly bleeding your opponent out with one of these isn't going to come to fruition. They'll just lose some life and beat you down because you played a card that didn't do anything. At number 5, it is Conservator. This artifact costs 4 mana, and you can pay 3 generic and tap it to prevent the next 2 damage that would be dealt to you this turn. Damage prevention is not exactly a powerful effect in most situations. After all, it doesn't even always do anything, and because this can only prevent damage that is dealt to you, it's even more limited than most damage prevention effects are. Add in the fact that you end up spending 7 mana to prevent the first 2 damage, and we're talking about a card that is both narrow and woefully overcosted. At number 4, it is Living Artifact, another aura. This one can enchant artifacts, and it costs a single green mana. With a name like Living Artifact, you might think that this can be used to animate an artifact, but nope. Once you enchant an artifact with this, anytime you're dealt damage, you can put that many vitality counters on Living Artifact. Then, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can remove one of those counters and gain 1 life. Yeah. No thanks. Obviously, this is another effect that simply isn't worth using a card on. Getting a single life every turn during your upkeep just isn't going to do a whole lot to keep you in a game, and you have to have an artifact to stick this on in the first place or it does stone nothing, and even when you do get it online, it doesn't do a whole lot more than stone nothing. At number 3, it is Celestial Prism. This 3-mana artifact lets you filter mana, but it does it incredibly inefficiently. You can pay 2 generic and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. Filtering mana itself isn't usually worth a card. The only time we've seen a filter artifact actually work out was Arkham's Astrolabe, which costs 1/3 of the mana to play, half the mana to filter, has a useful super type in Snow, and draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. That's a really pushed way to filter mana, and that's exactly what they had to do to make a card that filters good. So, obviously, Celestial Prism doesn't come anywhere close. Spending 5 total mana to filter your first mana feels absolutely miserable, and having to effectively pay 1 extra mana to cast things that are in a color you want to filter mana for is terrible too. At number 2, it is Farmstead, another aura. This costs 3 white mana and can enchant a land, and the controller of that land can pay 2 white mana during their upkeep to gain 1 life. Basically, this is a worse version of Living Artifact. It can gain you 1 life during your upkeep, but it makes you pay significant mana to do it. The mana cost also really limits the decks that even want to take a look at a card like this. But yeah, you're basically never going to get your value back if you cast this. Farmstead isn't mana efficient, and it isn't worth a card. And at number 1, I've got the Lace Cycle. They all cost a single mana of a single color, and they're all instants that can make a spell or permanent become that color. Yeah. That kind of effect is very rarely actually going to do anything. Sure, if you get some protection or other color hate stuff going, it can be kind of funny. However, that means you're playing a bunch of cards in your deck that only do their color hate effect in situations where you get your laces, in which case your deck is absolutely terrible. And I don't think using up a card to change the color of a spell or permanent is going to be worth it, even in a world where your deck is filled with silly color hate effects. We've seen a lot of useless cards in this video, but I think the Lace Cycle takes the cake when it comes to the worst cards in Alpha. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst cards in Alpha. If you want to own any of these for some reason, you can check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.